I've slightly revised the title of my talk to put in a bracket, pair of brackets, on the basis that that may be significant. But I'm going to move immediately to some particularly visible examples of the claim that 431 to 404 constitutes a single unitary event. Here are the cover sheet, cover pages, the titles of Thucydides' work in probably the two standard translations that everyone uses, one or another. The Peloponnesian War in the recent translation by Hammond, or The History of the Peloponnesian War in the Penguin Classics translation by Warner. Except that Thucydides doesn't actually call it that. Ancient books don't really have titles in the modern sense, no cover and no spine, but often the opening sentence of an ancient work of literature is used for that purpose, and it's notable that Thucydides' opening sentence does not say the Peloponnesian War, but instead the War of the Peloponnesians and of the Athenians, i.e. naming both sides. And it's that point that Minot is alluding to in his choice of title when translating for the Cambridge Texts in the History of Political Thought series. I'm not actually going to spend any more time on the difference of book title, though I'll be happy to deal with that in discussion afterwards. I've used it as my opening gambit simply to make the point that things which appear clear and uncontroversial may turn out to be more complex, and complex in interesting ways. So against that background, what I want to suggest in this talk is that a similar complexity may apply when it comes to counting the Peloponnesian War or Peloponnesian Wars. I started my talk with the proposition that the War of 431 to 404, Thucydides' War, is a single unitary event. The basis for this claim to unity is, of course, Thucydides himself, most explicitly in a passage known as the Second Preface, 526, where he justifies his decision to continue his history rather than breaking off in 421 at the Peace of Nicias, which had brought a formal end to the first 10 years of war. This, incidentally, is the one sentence in Thucydides' history that cannot have been written before the defeat of Athens in 404 BC, because he knows the total duration as being 27 years plus a few days. Given that he's writing as a contemporary, this invites speculation as to which other bits, if any, were written in knowledge of the eventual outcome. Now, Thucydides presents only limited chronological markers within the Second Preface itself. The total duration as just over 27 years, the first period of fighting as 10 years. He doesn't, in this passage, for instance, say in absolute terms when the war started, or restarted, or when it ended. But given that Thucydides is something of a date fetishist, it comes as no surprise to find chronological markers elsewhere in his history. In particular, and famously, Thucydides' primary narrative of the war itself starts by fixing the event that he sees as the outbreak, the Theban attack on Plataea, March or probably April 431 BC in our chronology, and matching this against multiple local calendars or events so as to serve as the starting point for his own incremental chronology. But throughout the rest of his history, he numbers the years of his war, with each of them divided into a summer campaigning season plus winter the rest of the year. And here's Thucydides' dating of the Peace of Nicias. He's very explicit about when it starts, spring 421, within a few days of being exactly 10 years after the outbreak of war in spring 431. Slightly less explicit about when the peace breaks down and formal hostilities restart, though here the uncertainty is not so much the absolute timing, but rather what event specifically he has in mind as marking 6 years and 10 months later. It's evidently something in late winter 415, 414. That means that the second period of fighting will also have lasted just over 10 years, early 414 down to Athens' surrender in spring 404. So, putting this together, that gives us a 27-year Thucydidean war, at least as he envisaged it in the second preface, though obviously his account breaks off in mid-411 BC. A 27-year war made up of two periods of formal hostilities, each of them lasting close to 10 years exactly. These two 10-year periods are what modern scholars, indeed some later ancient writers beginning in the 4th century, refer to respectively as the Archidamian War from 431 to 421, and what's called variously the Decelean or Ionian War from 414 to 404, separated by the 7-year interval of the Peace of Nicias, but in Thucydides' view, a period of Cold War. So, is this one war, or is it two? Or is it three? What makes things slightly more puzzling is that there had been an earlier period of fighting in the mid-5th century between broadly the same antagonists. This is what modern scholars sometimes call the First Peloponnesian War, though the name has never really caught on. It took place for approximately 15 years, from around 460 to around 445. The reason there's greater uncertainty over dating is that it doesn't form part of Thucydides' primary narrative in books 2 to 8, but instead is covered, very briefly covered, as part of his so-called Pentaconta Etia excursus or digression in book 1. The whole of the Pentaconta Etia excursus, covering the growth of Athenian imperial power over a period of some 50 years or so from 478 to 435, comprises less than 30 paragraphs of Thucydides' text, book 1, 89 to 117, and hence only some about a dozen pages in modern translations. Of this, the events of the First Peloponnesian War make up less than half, 103 to 115. The First Peloponnesian War involves primarily Athens on the one hand, and various past or future prominent Spartan allies on the other. Corinth consistently, but also Aegina, Megara, and Boeotia. That said, the Spartans themselves do get directly involved on several occasions. I've given you a map here just to remind the various places that I've mentioned. The war ends with what is more or less a restoration of the previous balance of power as it had been before 460. Athens gives up its short-lived control of Boeotia and Megara, but retains Aegina and recovers control of Euboea. It's that latter event, as you'll recall, that forms the starting point for the 30 Years' Peace. Here's a repeat of a previous slide. A question. We have here three potentially distinguishable periods of fighting between broadly the same antagonists over a period of some 55 years between around 460 and 404. The First Peloponnesian War, the Archidamian War, and the Ionian-Decelean War. So why does Thucydides insist that the second and third of these form a single unitary event to the exclusion of the First Peloponnesian War? This passage is the nearest that Thucydides comes to offering a justification. It's part of the second preface. But it boils down simply to argument by assertion that the Peace of Nicias was never wholehearted, which may indeed be true, but would apply to many other peace settlements throughout history. So I want to conclude my talk by suggesting that Thucydides may be playing games with us here, or at least that he may have additional hidden reasons for wanting to combine the events of 431 to 404 into a single war to the exclusion of 460 to 445. First then, why does he exclude the First Peloponnesian War? Sorry. Fundamentally, I suspect this is because Thucydides is a historiographical ideologue who believes that anything that happened before his adult lifetime is simply incapable of real knowledge, and therefore that history begins in 431 BC. Hence the relegation of the First Peloponnesian War to a brief account in the Pentaconta Aetia digression, precisely to mark it out as being prehistoric. But this opening passage of Thucydides' history is significant also for our understanding of my original research question, why he combines 431 to 404 into a single event. To understand that, it's worth paying attention to his opening explanation of why he had chosen to write the history of his war, and the claim in the passage here that he had perceived from the outset that this was going to be a great war. And in fact, he proceeds during his introductory methodological discussion, the so-called Archaeologia, Book 1, chapters 1 to 23, to put forward a grand theory of historical development designed precisely to demonstrate that previous generations simply hadn't had the economic resources to sustain total war on the scale of the late 5th century, so that his war is by definition greater than all previous wars. In that context, Thucydides develops what is at least superficially a rather clever argument that Homer's Trojan War cannot have been proper warfare, precisely because it had traditionally lasted 10 years. He's arguing here that the Greek forces at Troy must, in reality, have had to expend most of their energy gathering or growing food to sustain themselves, rather than actual fighting. But he ends the Archaeologia by presenting an explicit comparison with Herodotus' Persian War, arguing that the Persian War was over so quickly that it didn't really count as a great war, i.e. playing the argument both ways. What you'll have noticed in these last two slides is that the direct comparison is with Herodotus rather than with Homer. And I think there may be good reason for that. If Thucydides had directly compared his Peloponnesian War with the Homeric Trojan War, then the reader might start asking awkward questions about why the Peloponnesian War had to last 27 years. And I suspect part of the answer is that a 10-year Archidamian or 10-year Decelean war is not, in epic terms, obviously superior to a 10-year Trojan War, but that a 27-year Peloponnesian War definitely is.